Yeah. Okay, good. Thanks for coming to the final Center for Climatic Research, Climate, People, and Environment Program seminar series. It's been a fun year doing these remotely, and I'm hoping that next year we may be able to start bringing back in-person events, especially with some of our colleagues like today, who we're inviting to become part of CCR. But before we get into that, just want to go ahead and introduce our speaker for today. So Professor Min Chen is a brand new assistant professor in the Department of Forest and Wildlife Ecology. He's one of the hires that came in with the polar cluster hire on the emerging polar regions. And so he, along with some of the other speakers we've heard earlier this year and last year, we'll be all kind of putting Wisconsin on the map for polar research and bringing in a lot of interesting ideas in addition to just broadly the research that goes on in each of their individual labs and all sorts of things. Min in particular has been pushing the boundaries of Earth system modeling and remote sensing in a variety of ways. Even though he's an assistant professor, he's actually already kind of built a career and a record through his time in the past, and already has almost 60 papers published, and just a brand new research grant we were just talking about on the topic that you'll hear about today. So prior to arriving at Madison, he was actually at a place called the Joint Global Change Research Institute in the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory of the Department of Energy, which is ironically located in the East Coast of the United States in Maryland. There's some long story to that, but he was there for a while as a research scientist, and prior to that, was a postdoc at the Carnegie Institute at Stanford, and had gotten his PhD at Purdue and his undergraduate degrees in computer science and remote sensing and atmospheric science in Beijing Normal University. So multi-talented and a range of topics. Today we're going to hear about a topic that might sound at first somewhat esoteric and technical, but actually couples and directly into these questions of climate and carbon feedbacks. This idea of that plants actually emit their own kind of light. And this is called fluorescence. And so we'll hear a little bit about understanding the sun sensor geometry effects in solar induced fluorescence for better remote sensing of photosynthesis. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Min and we'll go ahead. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Uncle, and that's a very nice introduction. And I also appreciate the invitation to me for giving a seminar here. And I'm extremely happy to be affiliated with the Center of Climatic Research of the Nelson Institute. I think that gives me a unique opportunity to make broad collaborations with a number of great scientists here. So today, as Uncle mentioned, it's a little bit technical, but it's something that I have been really interested in the past 2 years. So that's the talk today will be about some of the recent work in my group on the remote sensing of solar-induced chlorophyll fluorescence. And as some of you might know, the solar-induced chlorophyll fluorescence, or SIF, is a novel and powerful remote sensing metric for approximating the terrestrial ecosystem carbon uptake by vegetation photosynthesis. And it's quite new because it's not available until just about 10 years ago. I'm not sure if you have attended a seminar last month by Dr. Joanna Joyner from NASA Goddard or not, but she is one of the pioneers of the remote sensing of SIF. So, but for today's talk, I'm going to introduce some of my high-level understanding of SIF, but we'll pay more attention to some sensor geometry effect of SIF observations and its applications, because such effect is an essential and classic problem in remote sensing of vegetation, but it hasn't received enough emphasis or attention or consideration until recent years. Oops. Yeah, first of all, I want to express my special thanks to Dr. Yelu Zheng and Dr. Dalai Hao, who has been working in my group in the past few years. they are the major leader of this the work I will talk about today. And yeah, and the financial support from the Pacific Northwestern National Labs LDRD program, and the NASA's Arctic Boreal vulnerability experiment and the remote sensing theory programs. Yeah, so actually my research on SIF originates from my interest in global carbon cycle, which is no doubt with great importance to the study of global climate system dynamics and climate change, because we know carbon dioxide is a major driver of recent climate change. And the figure here shows the most recent quantification of the major components of global carbon cycling processes, including the carbon fluxes between the land, ocean, and atmosphere, as well as the carbon storage in different carbon stocks in the Earth systems. And but here I want to draw your attention to the carbon fluxes, especially the largest number here, the 120 petagram carbon per year, or gigaton carbon per year. Essentially it's the same unit, but you can choose which one you like based on your own interest. So these two largest number are called, the left-hand side, the downward one is carbon uptake through vegetation photosynthesis. It's called, or we call it the gross primary production, or GPP. And the upper level is, the upward arrow is the ecosystem respiration through like plant autotrophic respiration and the respired carbon fluxes from the microbial activities underground. Yeah, actually the GPP, although they both show 120 here, as is with a big uncertainty, and actually the GPP is slightly larger than the ecosystem respiration. That resulted in like a small number of net carbon sink, about 3.4 petagram carbon per year. And the GPP here is particularly important, not because it's just the largest carbon fluxes in the whole global carbon cycle, and it's also a major driver of many ecological and land surface processes. But a critical problem for the quantification of GPP is that the current estimation of GPP is highly uncertain. The major reason that is we don't have a good way to measure global GPP. Well, leaf scale photosynthesis is measurable with some well-designed instruments, which Anko may know that pretty well. And some small landscape scale GPP can also be well estimated by eddy covariance flux towers. That's also for the Anko's expertise. But for the global GPP, we are heavily relying on terrestrial biosphere models, or some sort of bottom-up models that integrate all kinds of information to estimate the photosynthesis and the related carbon uptake. So the figure here shows here on the bottom left shows the distribution of global annual GPP estimated by 8 representative terrestrial biosphere models from ISMIP, which is a international model in the comparison project. And we can see the error bar spans a larger range. It could be like from 100 to under 40 petagram carbon per year. If you recall in the previous slides, we see the fossil fuel emissions only like 9 petagram carbon per year. Is almost 4 times larger than the anthropogenic emissions. And this uncertainty of GPP could result in partially canceled by the uncertainty of the ecosystem respiration, and resulting in smaller uncertainty in the net land carbon sink, or annual carbon land flux here. So historically, it's relatively small, but we can see as projected by the global climate model in the comparison project, this uncertainty will become larger and larger. Oops, sorry. So this remains a big challenge for us to understand, quantify, and constrain our estimates of GPP for better understand the ecosystem dynamics as well as climate change. So if we look back into the history of the quantification of global GPP, we may find remote sensing plays an increasingly important role. For example, in 1980s, the normalized difference vegetation index, or we normally know it as NDVI, was applied for empirically estimating net primary productivity. It's not GPP, it's just we usually consider it's proportional to GPP. And early version of global GPP product was MODIS, official MODIS GPP, which was built on the top of the MODIS estimated FPAR, which is a fraction of absorbed photosynthetic active radiation, and a simple light use efficiency model. And because of the growing size of the global network of eddy covariance towers, it provides a unique opportunity to use machine learning or other data-driven methods to upscale this site-level observations of GPP to its global scale. And these results are so far has been often used as a benchmark of the global GPP. But it still has problems that are well known. For example, it doesn't track the trends of GPP in a reasonable way. So essentially, these methods are combining satellite observed vegetation index or FPAR, as well as some meteorological or environmental factors to estimate GPP. And going to the recent decade, the newest breakthrough process is availability of the solar induced chlorophyll fluorescence, or SIF, which is actually not some designed mission for the satellite sensors. It's a kind of byproduct of satellite sensors for measuring atmospheric greenhouse gases. Some example includes like Japanese satellites GOSAT, Europe's GOMI and GOMI2, Schemati and TROPOMI, and NASA's OCO2 and OCO3 sensors. The power of SIF is that people found SIF is linearly correlated to GPP without introducing any additional information, such as meteorology or like soil moisture constraints. That means GPP can be estimated by a simple linear regression equation with SIF alone. So if you're interested in SIF, you may find tons of papers, publications using SIF as a direct proxy of GPP. But yeah, for today's talk, I'm going to do some clarification. It's not just we cannot treat SIF as a GPP, but there's a lot of factors that affects the SIF GPP linear relationship. So yes, the SIF sounds magic, right? But actually SIF is not something freshly new. At least a few decades ago, scientists have identified this phenomena and well understood some of the fundamental underlying processes. Essentially, when vegetation's leaf absorbs light, about like 60% of the light will be used for photosynthesis, and about 20% is used for non-photochemical quenching, such as heat dissipation, and only 1 to 2% is re-emitted by the vegetation leaves as a chlorophyll fluorescence. the peaking at regions near 685 nanometers and 740 nanometers. And because this energy of SIF is so small, it's very difficult to capture the SIF signal with satellite. And so that's only become possible about 10 years ago. So the picture on the right shows a beautiful illustration of satellite SIF observations. I think it's in the summer of the Northern Hemisphere. And we can see Wisconsin here is apparently a beautiful place with a lot of photosynthesis going on. Well, when I started to learn about some basic knowledge about solar induced fluorescence, I still feel such kind of really theoretical introduction is not enough for me to understand SIF. But I found a way that I think might be more intuitive. So here's a tiger in a room that's pooping and peeing. So the tiger can tell the zoo worker if they are sick, if he or she is sick. However, the zoo workers can collect the poop and the pee from the tiger to estimate how much they eat and drink every day to determine whether their diet is normal and also their health conditions. So here, the water the tiger drinks is comparable to the light absorbed by a leaf. Part of the water is used for supporting the tiger's daily metabolism, which is comparable to the energy used for photosynthesis. Another part of the drink water will be released as sweat. So that's something similar to like for non-photochemical quenching, such as heat dissipation. The sweat is also a way for the heat dissipation for the tiger's body. And the rest of the water becomes poop and peas. So just like SIF. So essentially, the idea of SIF is just the more you drink, the more you digest, and the more the tiger peas. So they are very correlated. So although this is a nasty example, but I think it's really explained what SIF is. I think this is especially interesting under like stress conditions because lots of people are using SIF as a good indicator for stress detection. So I think one intuitive example is that under heat stress, when it's very hot, the larger fraction, what we observed for SIF is that a larger fraction of leaf absorbed energy will use as MPQ or heat dissipation. And similarly, when it's too hot, the tiger will have more sweat for release the heat make themselves cooler. And yeah, so that's kind of intuitive example, but if we want to look into the scientific foundations, these figures show some theoretical analysis of how SIF and photosynthesis vary at different level of the photosynthetic active radiation, or PAR. Different colors in these panels indicate different VC max levels. VC max is it's a photosynthetic capacity related to the Rubisco carbon oxidation activities. So essentially, you can understand it as a photosynthetic capacity. So let's look at the bottom left panel first. It shows the SIF, the variation of SIF in response to different PAR levels. And on the bottom right shows the changes of photosynthesis, or A here, changes with PAR. We can see that SIF essentially changed linearly with the increase of PAR, but for the photosynthesis, it changes it's increased initially, but gets saturated at some point. Depends on the Vmax value. The transition point depends on the Vmax values here. And top panels show the photochemical yield. This is Vp here, and the fluorescence yield. Basically, they are the first order derivative of the SIF and the photosynthesis. So if we plot them together, we actually find the relationship between the years and between the photochemical yields and the fluorescence yield, and the SIF and GPP are not strictly linear. But usually we don't. The remote sensing observations are in the region that without, well, it's normalized condition or normal heat conditions. So it's in this region. It's close to the linear relationship, and the remote sensing snapshot is often only just at the top of the canopy. So we are actually looking at the regions of across different vegetations. They have a lower and higher level photosynthetic capacity. When we put them together, they also becomes a linear relationship at different APAR level absorption of photosynthetic active radiation levels. In the next few slides, I'm going to show a few mathematical equations, but I promise this will not exceed the knowledge of elementary school. So if we dig into more details with some simple mathematical models of photosynthesis and fluorescence, at leaf scale, the photosynthesis can be modeled in a light use efficiency way as A is photosynthesis and equals par multiplies absorption of par multiplied the photochemical yield. And the fluorescence, it can at a certain wavelengths can be modeled in a similar way, the par times of absorption coefficient and the fluorescence yield. So combining these two at leaf level, it's quite easy to use SIF to estimate the photosynthesis. Basically, it's just the SIF multiply the Vp divided by Vf. And if we go to canopy, which is of our interest, the things are a little bit more complicated. So at canopy scale, we call photosynthesis GPP equals to par times F par, which is a similar term as an absorption coefficient here. And a canopy level average light use efficiency, which is comparable to Vp here. And for fluorescence, it's also similarly, it's have a par, F par term and a light use efficiency term, but it's have additional term of escape ratio. Because SIF is basically some red or far red photons, it has a further interactive process, radiative transferring process inside the canopy. Only part of those SIF photons can escape the canopy to reach the satellite sensor. So combining these two, we found that GPP is equal to SIF multiply the product of light use efficiency for photosynthesis and the light use efficiency for fluorescence and the escape ratio. And this escape ratio, I know that I insert omega here, which is a parameter that denotes the sun sensor geometry, which is the focus of our talk today. Omega is a combination of 4 parameters, including the solar density angle, solar azimuth angle, and those 2 angles for the sensors. So this sun sensor geometry in the remote sensing community is also well known as a BRDF effect, the bidirectional reflectance distribution functional effects. So let's look into the escape ratio. The first is a function of wavelengths, because the canopy elements, or for example, the leaf and the pigment in the leaf absorb photons differently at different wavelengths. For example, a large absorption peak in red band and nearly no absorption beyond 700 nanometers. So we can imagine that escape ratio for red photons should be much less than the escape ratio of the far red photons. And escape ratio is also a function of sun sensor geometry described by this omega. The figure on the right illustrates a simplified thing, where the solar angle is fixed and the viewing angle changes. We can see surface reflectance changes dramatically. And of course, the highest reflectance may be found at the so-called hotspot angle. That means the sensor's viewing angle is exactly the same as the sun angle. And the lowest reflectance should be found at the dark spot angle, which is just the opposite angle to the hotspot angle. So it's pretty straightforward to see that the escape ratio of the hotspot angle should be larger than the escape ratio at the dark spot. And finally, the escape ratio is also a function of a canopy structure. I think a typical example is that the homogeneous vegetation canopy, for example, like the corn. You can see that pretty commonly in the Midwest. It usually looks much brighter than forest if you look at from the top of the atmosphere, because we can see a lot of dark spots in the forest because the heterogeneous structure of the forest, and these dark spots are actually the macro scale shadows in the view. So we can see that, for example, although Amazon forest has more leaves than the Corn Belt, so but it's much darker or have a lower canopy reflectance than the Corn Belt. So in terms of escape ratio, we can see that heterogeneous canopies escape ratio should be less than homogeneous canopies. So since a couple of years ago, I was interested in doing some research related to the escape ratio problem. In particular, that has resulted in 3 research questions as shown here. So the first one is how to quantify the escape ratio, because that's so important if you want to understand the CFGPP relationship correctly. That's something we need to have a good quantification. And the second is how to reduce or minimize the sun sensor geometry effect of SIF measurements. This is also important because if you want to compare SIF from one place to another place or from one time point to another time point, because the sun sensor geometry has changed, so it's not directly comparable. The only way we do that is we normalize it to a standard viewing direction, for example, the nadir direction. We can get them compared. And lastly, we always use this, we're always trying to remove this sun sensor geometry effect. But is it possible just to take advantage of that, because it also contains a lot of useful information? So I will present 3 papers that has been published in the past couple of years in my lab. And that's respectively respond to the 3 research questions listed here. So the first one was led by Dr. Yelu Zheng. This has been published a couple years ago and on remote sensing of environment. It's a proposed practical approach for estimating the escape ratio of the far-red solar-induced fluorescence. So intuitively, there are basically 2 methods for estimating escape ratio. The first one is, just very straightforwardly use canopy radiative transfer modeling that model the escape ratio as a function of leaf area index, leaf angle distribution, or clump index. These are the canopy structural parameters, as well as the sun-sense geometry parameters like omega here, as well, and the wavelength. The good thing is that it has explicit physics, and but the cons is that it requires a lot of inputs. For example, the LAD AOI clump index. These are all parameters not directly obtained through remote sensing. It has to be derived through some additional modeling work, and we know those parameters have huge uncertainties, and using that for estimating the escape ratio is apparently will have large uncertainties. And another way that we have been thinking, okay, so SIF is essentially some photons escaping the canopy. So that isn't that quite similar to the other, like to the surface reflectance or the vegetation reflectance, because they share some very similar or exactly the same radiative transfer processes. So our idea was to leverage some other remote sensing metrics that behave similarly to SIF in terms of radiative transfer. So we identified the reflectance of vegetation could be a good candidate for that. Well, that was just the rough idea, and we used some theoretical analysis to prove our concept. And we found that the spectral invariance theory is quite powerful to explain the radiative transferring process and makes the SIFs and other vegetation reflectance radiative transferring process directly comparable. For example, this is a figure adapted from the Mashak et al. 2011 paper. It's actually for for atmospheric radiative transfer. But here it's but for canopy radiative transfer, it's quite similar. So essentially, when you got solar radiation, part of it will be intercepted by the vegetation canopy, and there's the photons intercepted by the canopy leaves could have a certain reclesion probability to hit another canopy elements, for example, leaves, and a certain escape ratio, escape probability to get out of the canopy. So these 3 terms are called spectral invariant. The canopy interceptance, reclesion probability, escape probability. Those are some canopy level average terms, but they are called spectral invariants because they are only determined by the canopy structure. It's not related. It's not dependent on the wavelengths. So the escape ratio for SIF is essentially the sum of different orders of this escape probabilities. It's so written in the mathematic equations is just a geometric series of the escape probabilities and the reclesion and reclesion probabilities, as well as the element single scattering albedo. So So we can easily calculate escape ratio as a function of rho, p, and omega here. And for vegetation reflectance, it's actually have quite similar form as the escape ratio for SIF. The only difference is that it has two extra terms, I0 and omega there, because it has an additional process to accept to reflect the sunlight. So arranging these two together, we can get a very simple formula for escape ratio. That is just using R and the I0 and omega here. But that's still not straightforward enough, right? Because the R is easy to get. That's well, it's still not easy to get. The reflectance satellite measures is called surface reflectance. It's a combination of the vegetation reflectance and the soil contributions. And I0 is something that's existing in the modeling world. It's not something that satellites measurable. And omega lambda is something relatively easy. But we can do some further simplification. For example, when lambda is larger than 700 nanometers, that's a far-red SIF that we typically use. So the omega, the single scattering albedo is close to 1. And through some modeling analysis, we found I0, the kind of interceptance, is almost identical to FPAR. And yeah, for the vegetation reflectance, fortunately we have a new vegetation index developed, the NARV, that was used for approximate the vegetation, the reflectance of the pure vegetation. And the modeling analysis showing that it's also quite identical. The NARV is quite identical to the pure vegetation reflectance. Also, so there's a little bit biases here. So combining these two together, we can calculate the escape ratio at a certain sun sensor geometry omega can be calculated as NARV at the sun sensor geometry omega divided by FPAR. So these two terms are both observable, or either observable or retrievable from existing satellite products. And yeah, based on that, I think that it's worth noting there's some interesting derivations. For example, the SIF, we know SIF equals to par times FPAR times the light use efficiency F times escape ratio. And we have escape ratio calculated as NRV divided by FPAR. So SIF could be equal to NRV times par times light use efficiency F. So this light use efficiency F, the SIF's light use efficiency, it usually varies in a very small range. So SIF we can consider should be proportional to NRV times par, or the near infrared radiance, because the near infrared radiation is kind of proportional to par. So we have two independent studies that's not related to our theoretical analysis here. So one is led by Genghong Wu at the University of Illinois, and they found the user measurements of the near infrared reflectance, EVI, the enhanced vegetation index, and the near infrared NLV times par, and SIF measured at 760 nanometers wavelengths. And they found that NLV times par has better or at least similar performance in capturing the variations of GPP at their corn and soybean field. And the NRV times par and or SIF performs better than just the NRV and UVI, those vegetation indices. And another example is led by Dennis Baldacci that published in 2020. And they actually use instruments to directly measure the NRV radiance, the radiance in the near infrared band. And they found that the NRV radiance also has a strong linear correlation relationship with canopy scale photosynthesis for different like corn, tall cactus, annual grassland, alfalfa in California ecosystems. So that's I'm pretty excited to see the power of theoretical analysis, and those concepts can be approved by the real world measurements. And so with that formula, we can actually easily derive the way of removing the sun sensor geometry effects. Oops. So here we have the formula here, and we have safe observed of two different viewing angles, for example, omega-1 to omega-2. And we can easily correct the safe observed at sun sensor geometry omega-1 to omega-2 through this simple mathematical derivations. So for far red surface, we use an NRV, and for safe observed at red band, we use another vegetation index called redV. And this is just one method for removing or minimizing the sun sensor geometry effects that has been proposed in our paper published earlier this year on remote sensing of environment. And another way we propose to do that is the kernel, the semi-empirical kernel-driven model. Because it's a simplicity and underlying physical significance, the kernel-driven model has been widely used in modeling directional reflectance in the classic optical remote sensing. And we think that the similar approach can be directly applied to SIF as well. So essentially, this kernel-driven model estimates the directional reflectance as a weighted average of three types of surface reflectances. The first one is isotropic, and second is volumetric scattering, and the third is geometric scattering kernels. So essentially, we have looking into this figure, we have four types of surface reflectance. If we ignore the specular reflectance, that's not quite typical in our natural world. So we have the three types of isotropic, volume scattering for homogeneous vegetation canopy, and this gap-driven or this geometric-driven shadow-driven reflectance. So basically, this model is a combination of the combinations of the three types of surface reflectance. And we can fit the three parameters here, the FISO, FWORM, and FGO, to estimate this surface reflectance. And with that, we can just safe omega at omega-2 can be estimated by safe omega-1. Just like it's actually the same idea of the reflectance-based approach to use a kernel-driven model to estimate the reflectance. Yeah, we inserted par here because because the kernel-driven model needs the safe measurement to feed those parameters, but those measurements are usually taken at different times of day. So we need to normalize this SIF with with the photosynthetic active radiation. And we use the 3 multiple angular datasets that's provided by our European colleagues to evaluate the performance of the 2 proposed approach. And these datasets were collected for different vegetation types, including chickpea, grass, and rice. And all of them has been collected at different, basically different angles in the upper hemisphere. And that they represent some different leaf angle distributions and different levels of leaf area. Well, time goes fast. So yeah, let me quickly go through the results we have. So when we normalize these field observations of SIF to the nadir direction, which is the vertical observational direction, we found that comparing to the raw data, which is no normalization, we found that the reflectance-based approach and the current-driven approach reduce the differences between the nadir. Well, it's not reduced. It has estimates a closer estimation of the nadir observations. Probably this figure is more intuitive. So here's the raw data, and the black dots are the raw data. Blue dots and the red dots are just the reflectance-based and the current-driven model-based approach that compares to the nadir observations. So we found that comparing to the raw data, the two approaches for minimizing this sun sensor geometry effect effectively reduce this BRDF, the sun sensor geometry effect, although not completely remove all of them, because there's a lot of course, we know there's a limitation. For example, the SIF observations not correctly, and there's also a complicated structure that cannot be captured by these simple models. So the key message for this study that we can observe large BRDF. It's another name of sun sensor geometry effects of the SIF observations. And both reflectance-based and kernel-driven model could work effectively to reduce the BRDF effect. And the good thing for the NRV or red wave-based approach only depends on red and near-infrared reflectance. It's much easier to use, but we show that it's have relatively worse performance than the kernel-driven approach. But the kernel-driven approach requires a collection of directional SIF observations. That could be not usually available at the ground observations, but for satellite observation, we can take advantage of the width of the swaths, because the different pixels have different to sensor have different viewing angles. So far, we have been trying to remove or reduce the sun sensor geometry effect, because this is very important to make satellite measurements comparable, right? So one typical example is that in the previous, there has been a very hot topic in the debating the greening in the dry season of Amazon forest. So the Stock Martin's Nature paper published in 2014, when they applied for the BRDF correction or considering the sun sensor geometry effects, they found that the previous conclusion of the greening in the Amazon forest in dry season doesn't stand. So I'm not going to, there's an ongoing debate. I'm not going to judge which one is correct, right? I'm just introduced here as an example of the importance of reducing the sun sensor geometry effect. But this redundant information, could bring some added value in applications. I will show that in our last study here. In this study, we analyzed 4 types of the SIF measurements. some of them are not actually measurements. Let me just call it measurements temporarily. So the first one is nadir, which is vertical direction with 0 viewing zenith angle. And the second is the hemispherical observations. That's basically integration of the upper hemisphere observations. And third one is the hotspot. It's a very unique observation angle. It's sun tracking, basically follows the viewing angle, following the angle of the sun. So it's always observes the sunlit leaves, the no shaded leaves in its view. And the last one is total. It's the sum of SIF emitted by all leaves. It's actually not it's not observable metric, but can be obtained by model simulations or use SIF observations divided by escape ratio to get the total SIF total. Let's go back to the equations. So GPP is equal to SIF multiply LUE divided by LUEF and escape ratio. And from previous analysis, we know the SIF and GPP are theoretically not always linear. And we also use a process-based model called SCOPE to simulate this SIF and GPP relationship, as well as SIF yield and the photosynthetic and the light use efficiency for photosynthesis. So we do that. We do that in assume that SIF is observed in 4 different modes: the hotspot, nadir, and hemisphere, and total. So we found that the escape ratio in these 4 modes looks quite differently. So for example, in the nadir, hemisphere, and total, the escape ratio just flat. It doesn't change with the solar zenith angle. But for the hotspot angle, it changes with it increases with solar zenith angle. And that actually have a similar shape of the relationship of the SIF yield and light use efficiency for photosynthesis. Probably it's not clear to look in this way. Let me just rotate it. Looks like this. So now the x-axis is light use efficiency for photosynthesis, and axis is SIF yield. So basically, we see that the escape ratio and the relationship between SIF yield and light use efficiency for photosynthesis have a similar shape. So this kind of shape can be canceled in this formula, so that the GPP can be more linearly correlated with SIF. But for the other observation modes, the nadir hemisphere, the SIF yield and light use efficiency has really complicated relationship, and that could further complicate the SIF and GPP relationship. So we can see lots of this nonlinear relationship here. But for the hotspot, we can see a very straight line between the SIF and GPP. That means we can use the hotspot if we can correct the SIF observation to the hotspot angle with the angular normalization method we introduced just earlier in the earlier slides, we can probably better track the GPP. So we do some evaluation of this concept. The first one, we optimize the scope model at a number of global fluxnet size where data available. And here it shows just at one side, the scat plot between SIF and GPP at both hourly and daily time scale. Oops. So we can see that R square measures the linearity between the SIF and GPP. In the hotspot angle, it's much larger than the other 3 types of observation modes. And if we look at the difference of R square between hotspot and nadir SIF GPP correlations in different locations, we see at most sites, this this better performance of hotspot stands. And this is box plot of the R squares of for different observational modes and for different vegetation types. So basically, we see essentially the hotspot hotspot's viewing angle, especially outperforms other viewing directions. And we further evaluate the linearity of the SIF-GPU relationship based on the real data. We use the NASA's OCO2 observations. So we correct the SIF omega. Omega 1 is basically the sun sense geometry of the OCO2 observations. And we multiply the NRV in the hotspots and divide the NRV in the omega 1, the OCO2 sun sense geometry. And this NRV hotspot can get from the MODIS, the two NRVs can get from the MODIS BRDF product. So we found that very similar results. We found that the hotspot correction could give you a much better linearity between SIF and GPP relationship with higher R squares for either SIF measured at 757 nanometers or 771 nanometers. Okay, the whole time goes very fast. So the whole take-home message is that SIF has been increasingly used in the community, but sun sensor geometry effects really complicates the relationship and needs attention. And it has SIF has similar angular signatures of vegetation reflectance, provided radiative transfer series, and we can take advantage of that for reducing or minimizing these sun sensor geometry effects. And lastly, is angular effects not trash, but can be useful for improved SIF GPP linear relationship, and thus better track GPP, such as the hotspot angle. Okay, that's thank you very much for your attention, and I'm not sure if I have time for questions.
Thank you, Min. It was a master class on remote sensing and understanding all the complexities that go into making a good measurement from something like this. Yeah, I actually have to run to a meeting right now. So I'm going to go ahead. There is one question in the chat, so I'm going to go ahead and ask that, and then we can leave the call open if other people want to keep discussing. Can the escape ratio be used as a proxy for photosynthesis efficiency or representing the time varying function of the presence of leftover CO2, which is difficult to quantify and has to be removed by carbon capture and storage to achieve net zero emission? I think this kind of goes to your general question of like, well, beyond SIF being a proxy for photosynthesis, what other things can we actually use it for understanding ecosystems?
Yeah, that's really a good question. As I think the escape ratio is really powerful metrics that can be potentially used for just light use, used for approximating light use efficiency, as we've shown in our model simulations. And yeah. Also, it's not related, but physically it's not related to any leaf physiology, but it's just happened to have a similar shape of the light use efficiency.
Very cool. I'm going to run. I'll let the thank you for those who attended. If you do have follow-up questions, you can keep the call open for a minute or two. I have a ton of questions for you about SIF and non-photochemical quenching and NIR, but we will have plenty to talk about in the future.
Sure.
Thank you very much for coming. I'm looking forward to having you be more involved with the Center for Climate Research. This is the last CPEP seminar of the semester. It's kind of wild too to think about the semester winding down. We are looking to try to run this next year. Once we learn for sure what types of talks we can do, whether in person or remote, we will update you. But certainly if you have nominations for potential speakers that you'd like to bring, please do go ahead and send those information directly to me by email. And thank you very much, and have a good rest of your day.